What you're about to hear today is not just any story. This isn't about ordinary ghosts or typical hauntings. What I'm about to reveal will shake everything you've ever believed about life after death. And no, this isn't just some legend. I'm going to tell you the story of a cemetery where the souls don't rest. They seek revenge. It's a story so bizarre, even the most experienced grave diggers in town refuse to speak about it. You might think cemeteries are just dark, quiet places, but what if I told you some cemeteries hold more than just bodies? What if I told you that what happens after the sun sets could be more real and more terrifying than anything you've ever imagined? Get ready to understand something that will flip your perception of horror upside down. What Jack, the gravedigger, discovered that night isn't something you'll find in ghost stories. It's a chilling reality that no human should ever witness. But he saw it, and now, maybe you'll have to see it too. If you think you can watch this video out of mere curiosity, think again. Every second you spend watching, you're getting closer to the same mystery that caused Jack to disappear forever. And I promise you one thing. After watching this, you'll never look at a cemetery the same way again. That's a promise. So, if you have the courage, if you're still here, prepare yourself for a dive into the darkest secrets of the beyond. You've heard the rumors, right? About the things that happen after midnight. The whispers, the shadows, and the eerie sound that don't belong. But what if I told you that someone hears them every single night? Someone who's been doing this job for years. Someone who has seen things you wouldn't believe. The wind whispered to the graveyard as Jack, the gravekeeper, walked between rows of gravestones. The cemetery, bathed in moonlight, felt peaceful, but that peace had a strange way of turning to dread when the clock struck midnight. Jack had been working here for years, long enough to know every inch of the land, every tree, every crack in the stone. But lately, something felt off. It started one quiet evening, as Jack was finishing up his rounds. He stood by an old mausoleum when he noticed a shadow moving across the graves, yet there was no one in sight. He shrugged it off, dismissing it as his tired eyes playing tricks on him. It wasn't the first time, after all, but that would soon change. As days turned to weeks, the strange occurrences began piling up. Jack started hearing voices, low murmurs, as if the ground itself were speaking. At first, he thought it was just the wind, or maybe the rustling of leaves. But the whispers seemed different. They had substance, a kind of presence that shouldn't exist in a cemetery. Then came the footsteps, heavy, deliberate steps that echoed in the quiet night. Jack assumed it was another night watchman, but when he checked, there was no one there. The sound always vanished when he tried to follow it, leaving nothing but a feeling of cold dread. One night, as Jack stood near an old, weathered headstone, something caught his eye, a figure, barely visible in the mist. It looked like someone dressed in graveyard clothes. But there was no one else working that night, not a soul to be seen. He called out, but the figure didn't respond. It simply turned, moving slowly into the fog, vanishing into the night. Jack stood frozen, heart pounding in his chest. He had to know who or what was haunting this place. But as he tried to piece together the puzzle, he realized one unsettling truth. Some stories in the cemetery are meant to stay buried, and Jack's journey into the mystery of the graveyard had only just begun. As the nights passed, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The cemetery, once a place of calm and solitude, had become an ominous shadow over his life. He started arriving earlier, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever was that haunted these grounds, but each time the place seemed quieter than ever, too quiet. It was on one of those nights, when the air felt thicker than usual, that Jack noticed something strange. The same old mausoleum where he had seen the figure earlier, the door was slightly ajar. It hadn't been that way before. Jack, heart racing, approached cautiously, his footsteps muffled by the soft dirt beneath his boots. As he pushed the door open, a cold draft hit his face, like the breath of something that had been waiting for him. Inside, the air smelled musty, old. The faint sound of something scraping echoed in the dark corners, but when Jack shone his flashlight around, nothing was there. He stepped forward, his hand trembling slightly as he gripped the beam of light. As his flashlight landed on an ancient stone coffin, something caught his eye. It was a name, etched into stone, worn with age but still legible. Thaddeus Graves. Jack's breath hitched. He had never noticed this name before, but something about it felt familiar. The whispering voices, the strange shadows, the cold presence that seemed to follow him. It all pointed back to this name, Thaddeus Graves. Who was he? And why was his grave hidden so far back in the cemetery? The hairs on the back of Jack's neck stood on end as he knelt down to get a closer look. As soon as his fingers touched the stone, the ground beneath him trembled. The scraping noise grew louder, almost deafening. It felt as if the earth itself was alive, awakening from some long slumber. Then, as Jack stood up, his flashlight flickered and went out. The whispers, which had been so faint, now filled the air, growing louder with every passing second. "Leave," they hissed. "Leave now." Panicked, Jack scrambled to turn the flashlight back on. When the beam finally cut through the darkness, he saw something that made his blood run cold. A figure standing at the far end of the mausoleum. The same figure he had seen before, only now it was closer, much closer. This time, the figure didn't vanish into the fog. It stepped forward, its hollow eyes locked on Jack, its lips twisting into a silent, mocking grin. Jack couldn't move, his feet frozen in place by the terror that gripped him. Suddenly, a voice, deep and raspy, broke the silence. "You shouldn't have come here. Some graves are meant to stay undisturbed." The figure raised its hand, and the mausoleum door slammed shut with a deafening crash. Jack was trapped, alone with whatever it was that had haunted this place for so long. And as the dark figure drew closer, Jack realized he wasn't just dealing with a ghost. This was something much darker, and it wasn't ready to let him go. Jack's pulse raced as the figure moved closer, its steps echoing through the small mausoleum like thunder. The air grew colder, the temperature dropping rapidly, as if the very walls were closing around him. His breath came in short. Panic gasped as he backed away, desperate to find an escape. But the door, his only way out, was shut fast, as though an invisible force had locked it from the outside. He tried the handle again, pulling with all his strength, but it wouldn't budge. The figure was right behind him now. He could feel its presence, as if the space around him had been infected with something dark, something unnatural. The whispers grew louder, clearer, as if the walls themselves were speaking in 1,000 voices, all warning him. "Thaddeus Graves." The name repeated itself over and over until it sounded like a chant. The figure stood motionless, staring at Jack with eyes that seemed hollow, endless, an abyss that threatened to pull him in. Jack could barely think, his mind racing, trying to make sense of everything he'd witnessed. This wasn't just a ghost. It couldn't be. There was something deeper, darker at play. He had to get out. He had to... Suddenly, the ground beneath him trembled again. The entire mausoleum shook, the air filled with a low growl that seemed to come from the earth itself. Jack stumbled backward, his hands scraping against the cold stone walls as he tried to steady himself. Then, in an instant, the figure lunged forward, faster than Jack could react, its bony hands reaching out to grab him. A cold, unearthly chill passed through him as the figure touched his arm, sending a shockwave of terror through his body. "You shouldn't have disturbed me," the voice hissed, this time not from the figure's lips, but from the ground itself. Jack screamed, pulling away, but it was too late. The world around him blurred, and he felt himself being pulled into floor. His feet sank into ground as though it were swallowing him whole. The whispers grew louder, suffocating him, drowning him in their voices. Just as he thought he was about to disappear into the earth, everything stopped. The shaking ceased. The whispers fell silent. Jack opened his eyes, his body drenched in cold sweat. He was lying on the ground outside the mausoleum, gasping for air. The cemetery was still. No sounds, no whispers, only the soft rustle of leaves in the wind. But something had changed. He could feel it in his bones. The figure, the whispers, the dark presence, they hadn't left. They were still here, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the next soul foolish enough to uncover the cemetery's darkest secrets. Jack stumbled to his feet, heart still pounding, and turned to leave. But as he walked away, he caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of his eye. A figure standing at the far end of the graveyard, watching him. He couldn't see its face, but the shape was unmistakable. Thaddeus Graves. Jack's body froze once again. The name, the figure, it all made sense now. But it was too late. The cemetery had claimed him, and it wasn't about to let him go. Jack stumbled to the cemetery, his heart pounding in his chest, his mind a whirlwind of terror and confusion. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was following him, lurking just beyond the periphery of his vision. The figure he had seen, the one from the mausoleum, was no longer in sight, but Jack knew it was still out there, waiting for him. Every step he took fell heavier, as if the ground itself was pushing back, unwilling to let him leave. He turned to look over his shoulder, expecting to see the figure behind him. But there was nothing, just the twisted shapes of gravestones and the heavy, unnatural silence. The breeze that had once seemed calming now carried a sense of malice. It was as if the wind itself was trying to whisper something to him, something he couldn't quite understand. Jack's skin crawled, the hairs on his neck standing on end. He had to get out of here. The cemetery was no longer just a job. It was a prison, and the more Jack thought about it, the more he realized that the thing haunting this place wasn't a ghost. It was something far older, far more ancient, something tied to the land itself. As he approached the cemetery gates, Jack's foot caught on something, a small, weathered stone lying in his path. He looked down, expecting to see just another grave marker, but what he saw made his blood run cold. The stone wasn't a gravestone. It was a nameplate, engraved with the words, Thaddeus Graves. Jack froze. This wasn't possible. He had seen that name before in the mausoleum, etched into the stone. But how was this stone here, lying on the ground in front of him? And why had he never noticed it before? The whispers returned, louder this time, their voices filled with urgency and anger. Leave this place, or be buried with us. Jack stumbled back, his mind reeling. Was it a warning? A curse? Or something even worse? Suddenly, the ground beneath him shifted. Jack felt a sharp pull at his legs, as if the earth itself was trying to drag him down. He scrambled to his feet, but it was too late. The earth opened up beneath him, and he fell. The world spun, his body twisting in midair as he plunged deeper into the ground. He landed hard, his head slamming against something cold and unforgiving. His vision blurred, and for a moment, he couldn't make sense of where he was. He tried to stand, but his legs felt weak, as if the very air had drained him of all strength. The moment Jack looked around, his blood froze. He was no longer outside the cemetery. He was underground. A vast, ancient crypt stretched out before him, the walls lined with coffins, their lids slightly ajar. The stench of decay filled the air, suffocating him. And then from the shadows he saw them, dozens of figures, their eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. They weren't human. They moved toward him slowly, deliberately, their bodies twisted and deformed. Some had faces that were barely recognizable, while others had no faces at all, just empty sockets where their eyes should have been. Their mouths hung open, but no sound came from them. They were silent, but their presence spoke volumes. They were hungry. Jack's pulse raced as he backed away, but there was nowhere to go. He turned in every direction, looking for an exit, but the walls were closing in. He could feel their eyes on him, watching, waiting. The whispers were now a deafening chorus, filling his ears with their maddening sound. Thaddeus Graves. Jack's heart skipped a beat. He turned, and there, standing in the center of the crypt, was a figure, the same one that had haunted him since that first night. Thaddeus Graves. But now, Jack saw the full horror of what he was facing. The figure was no longer just a shadow. It was something far worse, a twisted, skeletal form draped in tattered clothing. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural light, a light that seemed to pierce straight through Jack's soul. "You should never have come here," Thaddeus whispered, his voice a rasping hiss that reverberated through the crypt. The ground trembled beneath Jack's feet, and the crypt seemed to come alive, the coffin shaking and creaking as if the dead within were beginning to stir. The whispers grew louder, louder than ever before, filling Jack's mind with cacophony of voices. "Leave or join us." Jack turned to run, but the air was thick with the weight of the crypt, and the walls seemed to shift around him, trapping him in this nightmare. He looked over his shoulder. Thaddeus was gone, but the shadows remained, closing around him. The whispers intensified, becoming deafening. Jack was no longer sure if he was even awake, or if this was all just a fevered dream. The ground beneath him quaked again, and Jack could feel himself falling deeper into the darkness. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything stopped. The whispers ceased. The ground stopped shaking. Jack opened his eyes, but he was no longer in the crypt. He was back at the cemetery gates. The world was silent. No shadows, no figures. But something had changed. Jack felt it in his bones. He wasn't alone. He turned, and there, in the distance, standing at the edge of the graveyard, was Thaddeus Graves, watching, waiting. The game had only just begun. Jack's legs felt like jelly as he stumbled away from the graveyard gates. He didn't dare look back, not wanting to see what might be following him, or worse, what might have stayed behind. But as he reached the end of the cemetery, a cold, unnatural breeze swept through the air, causing him to shiver violently. His breath came in ragged gasps, his body exhausted from the terror he had endured, but something deeper inside him kept pushing him forward. Fear, instinct, and the need to escape. But as he reached the road beyond the cemetery, he heard it, that unmistakable sound. Footsteps, slow, methodical, relentless. He froze. Jack slowly turned his head, and there, just past the gates, was Thaddeus Graves, not standing still this time, but walking toward him, step by step, slowly, deliberately. Jack's heart raced in his chest as he realized that no matter how fast he ran, The figure was always closer, always just behind him. With each step, the figure seemed to grow larger, its form becoming more defined, more tangible, as if it were walking out of the very ground itself. Thaddeus's eyes locked onto Jack's, and in that moment, Jack felt as if he were no longer in control of his own body. The world seemed to tilt, as if the line between the living and the dead was beginning to blur. "You can never escape," Thaddeus whispered, his voice a low growl that vibrated through the air. Jack's knees buckled, and he fell to the ground, too terrified to move, to breathe, to even think. The figure's eyes gleamed brighter, like twin orbs of fire, burning into Jack's soul. And as it drew closer, the whispers returned, filling his mind with incoherent fragments of sentences, names, places, things he couldn't understand. "This is your fate," Thaddeus's voice boomed, shaking the ground beneath Jack. "All who disturb me must pay the price." Jack looked around desperately, his hands grasping at the dirt, the ground, as if he could somehow dig himself out of this nightmare. The air was thick now, suffocating, making it harder to breathe. The graveyard seemed to stretch out endlessly before him, the gravestones rising like ominous towers, casting long shadows that reached for him. He could feel the weight of their eyes, the weight of the cemetery, pressing down on him. Jack wasn't just being hunted by Thaddeus. He was being drawn deeper into the cemetery itself, into its secrets, its curses. And just as Thaddeus reached out to touch him, to claim him, the world around Jack shattered. The gravestones, the air, the earth, all of it splintered and fragmented like glass. The ground beneath Jack's feet gave way, and he fell once again deeper into the abyss. But this time, there was no land to catch him. There was only darkness. And as the last flicker of light died, Jack heard the faintest whisper just beyond his reach. "You will never leave. Not now, not ever." What you're